Ernest Hemingway was 38 years old. He had achieved enormous success as a writer of short stories, novels, and journalism. He had found his voice, his unique iceberg style, direct, understated, but hinting at so much more beneath the surface. He had a comfortable lifestyle, an adoring family, and regular visitors to his house in Key West to keep his mind active without getting in the way of his work. But it wasn't enough. He needed something new, something to get excited about, something dangerous. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today we're exploring the life of Ernest Hemingway, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and a bit of an adrenaline junkie. In this video, I'll be focusing on the second half of his life, his involvement in the Spanish Civil War, his spying in the Caribbean, his World War II exploits, his marriages and romances, and his tragic final year. To fully get to grips with the legend that is Hemingway, it is important to understand his difficult early life, his experiences as a Red Cross ambulance driver in Italy in the First World War, and his Paris years, where he mixed with the greats of modernism in all art forms and had his first successes as a writer. These important formative years are covered in my first video, and I'd recommend starting there, unless, like Hemingway, you just want to get stuck in. In December 1936, an ambitious young journalist and Hemingway fan walked into Sloppy Joe's bar in Key West. Martha Gellhorn got talking to her hero and got him all fired up about going to Spain to cover the Civil War. Understandably, Pauline was not keen, concerned about the dangers, and not just from the war. He went anyway, travelling to Madrid in March 1937, where he penned 31 dispatches for the North American Newspaper Alliance, wrote a play, and collaborated as scriptwriter, narrator, and in the production of a pro-Republican film, The Spanish Earth.
But where will we go? Where can we live? What can we do for a living?
But it was in Spain that he fell out with longtime friend John Dos Passos. At the time, Dos Passos had been on the cover of Time magazine to mark the publication of the third instalment of his USA trilogy, which was critically acclaimed and selling well. And he was at least the equal of Hemingway in terms of literary stature. As members of the Lost generation, they had got to know each other in Paris and were good friends, but they parted company in Spain and the rift was never healed. Later, in Hemingway's posthumously published A Movable Feast, his memoirs of his Paris years, he was very unflattering about Dos Passos, likening him to a pilot fish, a small fish that swims with sharks, gaining from their more powerful companions' ability to scare off predators and feeding off their parasites and scraps. I think it is worth trying to understand why they fell out, as it says a lot about Hemingway's personality. The Civil War in Spain had begun in July 1936, and theoretically was between the left-leaning Republican forces and the right-wing nationalist forces. But almost from the outset, there was heavy involvement from other countries. Germany, Italy and Portugal supporting the nationalists, and the Soviet Union and Mexico supporting the Republicans. And by support, we're talking tanks, aircraft, warships, and thousands of soldiers in a savage conflict that is often referred to as the trial run for World War II. In early 1937, José Robles, a left-wing writer, academic and translator who was a good friend of Dos Passos, disappeared and was executed, probably on the orders of Alexander Orlov of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Hemingway condoned the killing, seeing it as necessary in a time of war. While Dos Passos was concerned about his friend's family and troubled by the abuse of power and willingness of Hemingway to lend his name to Russian fake news to cover up Robles's murder. After their split, Hemingway wrote a thinly disguised article about the episode for Ken magazine, describing Dos Passos' scruples as the good-natured naivete of a typical American liberal attitude, and Dos Passos himself as white as the underhalf of an unsold flounder at 11 o'clock in the morning, just before the fish market shuts. Whilst one can admire the sheer inventiveness of his put-down, this was a recurring theme across Hemingway's life. Erstwhile friends would suddenly be turned upon and viciously attacked for daring to disagree with him. Reflecting later, without bitterness, Dos Passos wrote that even in their Paris days, long before he was famous, Hemingway was always competitive and critical, overly so. But in the early days, you could kid him out of it. Dos Passos put it down to Hemingway's bad heredity, his overbearing father and distinctly odd mother. But Spain is also where his relationship with Martha Gellhorn blossomed. On first meeting him in Key West, Martha wrote to her friend Eleanor Roosevelt that he was an odd bird, very lovable and full of fire, and a marvellous storyteller. It's not certain when their working relationship became more intimate. The movie of their lives together gives a version, and some of it certainly happened, but we don't really know which bits are true and which aren't. What we do know, however, is that their affair continued after Spain, between their various assignments as Hemingway's marriage to Pauline slowly fizzled out. Pauline did not give up without a fight, however, travelling to Paris to surprise him in December 1937, having grown her hair long to how he now liked it. But the meeting was disastrous, with Pauline raging at him for his continued infidelities and threatening to throw herself off the hotel balcony, and Hemingway rushing off to a doctor with acute abdominal pain. He was prescribed medication that was believed at the time to protect his liver and told never to drink again. Gellhorn is now considered one of the finest war correspondents of the 20th century, and she seemed to reinvigorate Hemingway, forcing him out of his cosy, comfortable life in Florida and his 15 scotch and sodas a day, and back out into the dangers of the front line to get a good story. She was different to his previous partners, 9 years younger, but fiercely independent and strong-willed. She was able to stand up to him, and did. In 1939, Hemingway finally separated from Pauline and relocated to Cuba with Martha. They leased and later bought a 15-acre, beautiful but dilapidated farmhouse near Havana, the Finca Vigía, where he worked on his next novel, rising at 5 and working till 12, oblivious to everything else going on around him and yelling at anyone making a noise. The house needed a lot of work, and Gellhorn complained to a friend that he was about as much use as a stuffed squirrel. But he is turning out a beautiful story, and nothing on earth besides matters to him. For Whom the Bell Tolls was published the following year to good reviews. It sold 500,000 copies in its first 3 months and firmly re-established his literary reputation. He also signed a film deal with Paramount worth nearly $150,000, which made him financially secure. And when his divorce from Pauline was finalised, he married Martha Gellhorn. The following year, they travelled to China via Hawaii. Gellhorn had been asked to cover the Sino-Japanese War for Collier's magazine, and Hemingway accompanied her. For the first time in his life, he was not the star of the show, and he didn't particularly enjoy his time in China. Back in Cuba by the end of 1941, Hemingway prepared his boat, the Pilar, for patrolling against German submarines and managed to persuade the Cuban government to pay for the refit. There are all sorts of stories about him being involved with US intelligence agencies in Cuba, even with the Soviet NKVD at various points during the war. But his involvement seems to have been peripheral, and any information he supplied no more than what he would have written as a journalist. What he struggled to do, however, was write. He was drinking too much, often late into the night, but that was nothing new, and he was irritable and occasionally violent towards Martha. He was depressed by news of the war, and all of this combined to cause such a complete creative drought that he didn't publish anything of significance in the 1940s. Martha was busy with her career, travelling around the Caribbean and spending months in Europe. When she returned to Cuba, they just argued. Perhaps sensing that time was running out if he wanted to be part of the war in any way, Hemingway flew to London in May 1944 as an official war correspondent. While being driven back home from a party late one night in the blacked-out city, his driver ploughed into a water tank. Concussed and with his head and face badly cut, he was taken to St George's Hospital for treatment and 57 stitches, and this is where Martha caught up with him. She was angry as she had been forced to spend 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic in a cargo ship filled with dynamite at the mercy of German U-boats because her husband had been disinclined to get her a press pass on a plane. So when she arrived, she was decidedly unsympathetic. Neither was she impressed to find empty bottles of whiskey under his hospital bed. He seemed more interested in drinking and regaling hangers-on in his hotel with his stories than spending time with her. And when he was with her, he couldn't help himself goading and embarrassing her, often reducing her to tears. Finally, when he stood her up for dinner one night in favour of Mary Welsh, another young American journalist, that was it. Martha told him he was a bully and she'd had enough. So, it was on to 36-year-old Mary Welsh. As usual, he became infatuated and asked her to marry him on only their third meeting, even though she was still married to Noel Monks, an Australian journalist. When D-Day came, Hemingway was on a landing craft at Omaha Beach, and judging from his published account of the experience, you would think that he led the invasion. He was there all right, but he stayed on the boat and was back in his hotel in time for dinner, while many others on that day were not so fortunate. He returned to France later and became involved with a group of resistance fighters and ended up as some kind of unofficial commander. As a war correspondent, he was not meant to take up arms, of course, and at one point it looked as if he might get into trouble. But he managed to get away with it by saying he only offered advice. In August 1944, he was present at the liberation of Paris, and new love, Mary, joined him at the Ritz Hotel as he reunited with old friends including Picasso and Gertrude Stein. In the autumn, he covered the drawn-out and costly Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where he contracted pneumonia. Despite being ill, he persuaded someone to drive him to Luxembourg to cover the Germans' last-ditch offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Hemingway, though, was so ill, he was immediately hospitalised, and as penicillin was still almost exclusively reserved for combat troops, his bout of pneumonia was yet another life-threatening illness. In March 1946, after his divorce from Martha came through, and Mary's divorce from her husband was finalised, they married in Cuba. He began work on The Garden of Eden, finishing 800 pages by June. The novel is a very modern exploration of male-female relationships and reversal of gender roles, with echoes of the strange ménage à trois he had with Hadley and Pauline in the 20s. Although he continued working on it for the rest of his life, he never finished it. A heavily edited version was published posthumously in 1986, and there is a 2008 movie, but both are controversial. Later in the year, Mary had emergency surgery for an ectopic pregnancy, which meant she was unable to have children. In 1947, Hemingway was awarded a Bronze Star for his bravery during World War II. The medal is usually reserved for combat personnel, but occasionally given to civilians, and he was recognised for having been under fire in combat areas in order to obtain an accurate picture of conditions. But the years were beginning to catch up with Ernest Hemingway. His blood pressure was up, as was his weight, and this eventually led to diabetes. He also began to suffer from blinding headaches, all made worse, of course, by his heavy drinking. Having stalled on The Garden of Eden, he began work on a trilogy of sea-themed books, but struggled to make progress, and this too was never completed, although it was eventually published posthumously as Islands in the Stream. In 1948, Hemingway and Mary travelled to Europe. they skied in Italy, and in December, on a duck hunting trip on the Po, the now 49-year-old writer met a girl who would become his muse for the next 5 years and reinvigorate his writing. 18-year-old Adriana Ivancic, from an aristocratic but cash-strapped family. So much of the discussion about their relationship focuses on the did they, didn't they question that it is hard to know what to believe. Adriana herself said they were just friends, but that Hemingway wanted it to be more. How seriously she considered his advances we don't know, but his Hollywood handsome days were long gone. He had piled on the weight, frazzled his skin with years of Caribbean sun, and according to another woman he fell in love with around this time, actress Jiggy Viertel, his personal hygiene was less than perfect, and his faintly unkempt odour was enough to put anyone off. Mary broke her ankle on the slopes, and Ernest developed erysipelas, a facial skin infection which had to be treated with high doses of penicillin. Like so many of Hemingway's other medical issues, this could have been serious, with the potential to develop into an infection of deeper tissues and threaten his eyesight. As it was, he was just left with his face covered with crusts. He and Mary remained in Venice for several months, with Hemingway sneaking out to meet Adriana in bars. Whatever the nature of their relationship, he was inspired to embark on another novel, Across the River and Into the Trees, his first new book in 10 years. Completed in Cuba, where Adriana visited him, and published in 1950, it was met with hostile reviews. J. Donald Adams in the New York Times describing it as one of the saddest books he had ever read. Not because I am moved to compassion by the conjunction of love and death in the Colonel's life, but because a great talent has come, whether for now or forever, to such a dead end. Tennessee Williams was almost a lone voice in saying that it is one of Hemingway's finest works. There is a new movie based on the novel which is due to be released soon, which will hopefully do it justice. Hemingway was furious at the critical reception of his book and threw himself into writing the first draft of The Old Man and the Sea, which he dashed off in only 8 weeks. His shortest novel, about an ageing and unlucky fisherman's battle with a giant marlin, has been described as a testament to resilience and personal triumph even in the midst of defeat. Published in full in Time in May 1952, the magazine sold over 5 million copies and won the Pulitzer Prize the following year. In January 1954, in his second hunting trip to Africa, Hemingway was seriously injured in 2 plane crashes. He had chartered a sightseeing flight to see the Murchison Falls in what was then the Belgian Congo, but the plane struck a telegraph wire and crash-landed in heavy bush. The next day, they boarded a second plane to get to Uganda for medical care, but this one burst into flames on takeoff, and finding the door jammed, Hemingway used his head as a battering ram twice to force open the door to get out. When they eventually arrived in Uganda, they found reporters covering the story of their deaths, and Hemingway amused himself by reading his obituaries while recovering from his injuries. Burns, 2 cracked discs, a damaged kidney, a ruptured liver, a dislocated shoulder, and a fractured skull, complicated by cerebrospinal fluid leaking from his ear and temporary blindness in the right eye. Nothing too serious. He seemed to have recovered and was able to go on a fishing expedition in February with his son Patrick, but he was still in a lot of pain, which made him irritable, and while trying to extinguish their campfire, he fell into the flames and suffered second-degree burns on his legs, torso, lips, left hand and right forearm. These accidents in quick succession seemed to bring about a physical decline. Although he had been a functioning alcoholic for much of his life, he drank more heavily than ever to combat the pain of his injuries. In October 1954, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for his mastery of the art of narrative, most recently demonstrated in The Old Man and the Sea, and for the influence he has exerted on contemporary style.
Today I had no idea that I would win the award, but since I have, I'm very pleased. If I had not won it, I would congratulate whoever won it.
Listening to some of his interviews at this time, I was struck by how odd his speech sounds. It's very monotone and lacking in normal intonation and prosody. Speech abnormalities can occur in a number of neurological conditions, including traumatic brain injury, dementia, and as a result of cirrhosis. But it has often been said that Hemingway's characteristically lean writing style was also the way he spoke. So maybe it was just him. But there are other recordings of him speaking before and after this, in which he's much more fluent. So it's really hard to know what was going on in his brain at this point. Hemingway modestly told the press that others deserved the prize more than he, but he would gladly accept it anyway. But he was in too much pain to travel to Stockholm to receive the award. In early 1956, he was bedridden for months. His doctors warned him to stop drinking as he had clear signs of liver damage, and he listened for a while, but not for long. In October 1956, he returned to Europe, but became sick again and was treated for high blood pressure, liver disease, and arteriosclerosis. The following month he was in Paris, and while having lunch at the Ritz, he was reminded of 2 trunks he had put into store in the hotel in 1928 and never retrieved. They contained a ragtag collection of clothes, menus, receipts, hunting paraphernalia, correspondence, and 2 stacks of notebooks listing who he had met and what he had done when he had lived in Paris in the 1920s. Back in Cuba, he excitedly began collecting and editing his notes into his memoir, A Movable Feast. And although he more or less finished the book, it was not published during his lifetime, but in a version edited by his widow Mary in 1964. It's a fascinating book, but his negativity about F. Scott Fitzgerald and John Dos Passos does say quite a lot about his insecurities. He was also working on True at First Light, a mixture of fiction and reminiscence about his trip to Africa with Mary, which swelled to over 200,000 words. His Sea Trilogy, and adding chapters to the Garden of Eden. But despite his productivity, he gradually slid into a state of depression, from which he never really recovered. He was unhappy with the constant stream of guests and tourists at the Finca Vigía, and when some of General Batista's soldiers clubbed to death his trusty old hound, Black Dog, when they raided the house looking for guns, he began to realise that it was time to make a permanent move back to the States. "Poor old Black Dog," he said. "I miss him. In the early morning when I work, he's not here on the kudu skin beside the typewriter. And in the afternoon when I swim, he's not hunting lizards beside the pool. And in the evenings when I sit in my chair to read, his chin isn't resting on my foot. I miss Black Dog as much as I miss any friend I ever lost." He continued adding to and editing his works in progress, and in the summer of 1959 he visited Spain and his beloved Pamplona to research a series of bullfighting articles commissioned by Life magazine. He was interviewed by a young Irish journalist, Valerie Danby Smith, who he persuaded to come and work for him as his private secretary. In her book, she recalls that at this time he was still full of life, reading 3 books a week and had total recall ability. But others began to feel he was not himself. Life only wanted 10,000 words, but the manuscript grew out of control to 130,000 words, and he struggled to organise his writing for the first time in his life. So he asked friend and screenwriter Aaron Hotchner to travel to Cuba for assistance. Hotchner helped him trim the piece down for the magazine and prepare a longer book version, The Dangerous Summer, but described him as unusually hesitant, disorganised, and confused. Reluctant at first to accept Hotchner's suggestions, he eventually agreed, writing in a letter, "I'll tell you, Hotch, it's like being in a Kafka nightmare. I act cheerful, like always, but am not. I'm bone-tired and very beat up emotionally." The political situation in Cuba was getting ever more complex. Castro had been in charge since early 1959, and his government had begun its agrarian reforms by nationalizing large estates and foreign-owned landholdings, and tensions with the US were rising. As someone who did not like right-wing dictators, Hemingway had been broadly supportive of the revolution, and even met Castro once, just for a few minutes, when, of all the things they could have talked about, they talked about fishing. But in July 1960, the Hemingways left Cuba forever. They rented an apartment off Central Park in New York, but Hemingway struggled to work as he missed the quiet and space of the Finca Vigía and his cats, so he made what turned out to be his final trip to Spain, somewhere that always lifted his spirits. But this time, he took to his bed for several days and barely spoke, despite the first instalments of The Dangerous Summer published in Life receiving good reviews. After arriving back in New York in October, he refused to leave his apartment, fearing he was being watched. So Mary took him back to Idaho. He was constantly worrying about money and his taxes, and that he would never be able to return to Cuba to retrieve the manuscripts and art he had left in a bank vault in Havana. And he became convinced the FBI was actively monitoring him in Ketchum. His friend and doctor, George Saviers, flew him to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota at the end of November, checking him in under his own name to maintain anonymity. He was told it was for blood pressure treatment, as he would not have agreed to go otherwise. But it was really for treatment of his depression. His doctors told him his low mood may have been caused by his long-term use of reserpine and methylphenidate. Reserpine had been available since 1954 and was used as one of the early treatments for high blood pressure, and it did make some people depressed as a side effect. But it was also widely used in psychiatry for calming and treating people with agitated depression and psychosis. Methylphenidate, best known under the brand name Ritalin, was introduced to the US in 1957 and was initially used as a treatment for memory problems. Long-term use is associated with a slightly increased risk of depression. So yes, the medication could have contributed to his depression, but it seems to me far more likely that the main causative factors were his genetic inheritance, his 8 or 9 head injuries, and his drinking. He had a course of 10 to 15 electroconvulsive therapy or ECT treatments in December and January. He had short-lived memory problems after the treatments, but this passed, and a secretary was brought in to help him deal with his correspondence, which he was able to do for several hours a day. His mood was brighter, he was less paranoid, and he went out to coffee shops with Mary. He even went trap shooting with one of his doctors, hitting 27 consecutive clay pigeons. He was almost well enough to attend President Kennedy's inauguration, to which he'd been invited, but in the end, he gave his apologies. He was discharged after 7 weeks and returned home. He was told he could drink wine, but no more than 1 litre or 33 fluid ounces a day. 1 litre? I'm not sure if this is true or not, but it seems incredible advice, even for 1961, when people weren't quite so aware of the dangers of alcohol. Better advice would have been to pour it down the sink. At first he took long walks and went trap shooting most days, but by the end of March his mood dropped again. He thought he had messed up his Paris memoirs, and one morning his wife found him holding a shotgun in the kitchen. It was a struggle to get him back to the Mayo Clinic. He tried to open the door of the plane and jump out, and when it stopped to refuel, he tried to walk in front of the propellers of a taxiing plane. This time he was assigned to a locked ward, where head of psychiatry Dr. Howard Rome diagnosed agitated depression, loss of self-esteem, ideas of worthlessness, and a searing sense of guilt. He was administered further shock treatments, 4 in the first 5 days. And as before, he seemed to improve and was going out for walks in the local area. Mary, however, wasn't convinced, and feeling he was conning his psychiatrist that he was better, she looked into getting him transferred to the Institute of the Living in Hartford, Connecticut. But before she could make plans, he was discharged on the 26th of June. A 5-day drive later, and he was back home in Ketchum. At what turned out to be a final meal at Cristiano restaurant, he was worried by the presence of two salesmen who he thought were FBI agents. The next morning, Mary found him dead from a shotgun wound. Initially, she said it was an accident, and this allowed him to be buried in the Catholic cemetery. But in an interview 5 years later, she confirmed what everyone already knew, that he had deliberately shot himself. There is no denying that Ernest Hemingway had a huge influence on American literature, with his unique, instantly recognizable style. Lean, apparently simple, but hinting at so much unsaid beneath the surface. Not everyone liked his writing at the time, and there are plenty today who criticize some of the values they believe he represents, with some even calling for him to be cancelled. And yet, despite all the naysayers then and now, his books are still being read and discussed, and barely a year goes by without another biography or interpretation of his work of some kind. And although his work hasn't always transferred that well to the screen, movies are still being made about him or based on his works. But as a psychiatrist, it is his struggle with his mental health that I am most interested in. We know where it ended, but where did that struggle start? And how did his battle with his inner demons shape his tumultuous life and influence his writing? But before we get too psychological, we also have to think about his extraordinary physical health history. All those accidents and illnesses, what effect did they have on his brain and sense of himself? Poor eyesight, concussions in high school football, shrapnel wounds, machine gun wounds, hepatitis, the head injury from the Parisian hotel skylight, anthrax on honeymoon in the south of France, fractured ribs in the Pamplona bullring, the spiral fracture of his right arm and radial nerve damage from car crash number 1, amoebic dysentery and prolapsed rectum in Kenya, liver problems in Paris, another head injury from car crash number 2 in London, another head injury weeks later from a motorbike crash in Normandy, pneumonia in the Battle of the Bulge, erysipelas in Italy, multiple life-threatening injuries from 2 plane crashes in 2 days in Africa, a lacerated forehead in a car crash in Cuba, another concussion from slipping on the deck of the Pilar when drunk, high blood pressure and diabetes. Quite a catalogue. And of course, accidents do not occur randomly. If you're impulsive and impatient and rush into everything with great gusto, you are more likely to become a casualty of your own enthusiasm. Hemingway was rarely lukewarm about anything. It was either full speed or don't bother. And this is why the list is so long. And it is quite possible that each head injury made him more reckless and devil-may-care, increasing his risk of having another. Banging your head really isn't good for your brain. Banging your head repeatedly is even less good. And Hemingway had at least 8 or 9 separate head injuries, which resulted in him being dazed or losing consciousness. The most serious of these was in Africa in 1956, when he fractured his skull and had cerebrospinal fluid leaking out of his ear. The idea that repeated head injuries could lead to a progressive condition of memory and other cognitive difficulties and neurological symptoms goes back at least 100 years. But it is only recently that punch-drunk syndrome, dementia pugilistica, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy has been taken seriously, following the landmark NFL payout of over $700 million to former players in 2013. But Hemingway knew about punch-drunk boxers. He wrote about one in a short story. But how much of his own decline was due to his brain being rattled around, and how much due to his diabetes, blood pressure, and alcohol, we simply don't know. We do know that Hemingway had a drink problem. He knew it too, and tried many times to reduce his drinking by setting himself rules and limits, such as never before noon. But he just couldn't stick to them. and visitors would often observe him having an eye-opener when he started work at 5 a.m. and continuing his work with a glass in hand. He started when he was 15 and at times drank a bottle of scotch a day, more when he was depressed. His liver was already showing signs of damage in 1937, when he was still in his 30s. But try as he might, he just couldn't stop. His drinking frequently made him irritable and belligerent, getting him into fights and leading to more knocks to his head when he fell over. Drinking to excess and risk-taking often occur in people who have experienced trauma, and Hemingway had more than his fair share. From the mutilated remains of the First World War munitions factory explosion to helping retrieve the bloated, decomposing bodies of the 400 souls washed away by the devastating hurricane which hit the Florida Keys in 1935. There were also the more domestic traumas of seeing his old dog clubbed to death and another shot by Batista's soldiers in Cuba. And he was deeply affected by having to put down one of his cats that had been run over. It may seem strange that someone who happily blasted away at anything that moved in Africa and Idaho could be so distressed by the loss of a pet. But as he said himself, "Have had to shoot people, but never anyone I knew and loved for 11 years, nor anyone that purred with 2 broken legs." So, despite his hard-living, tough guy, He-Man image, he was quite a softy at heart. Although he did do quite a good job at keeping it hidden. And let's face it, he wasn't great with relationships. 4 wives and numerous affairs attest to that. He once wrote that the things he loved were, in the following order, good soldiers, animals, and women. Personally, I'm not sure they were that high up. And I'm not convinced by the idea that it was his rejection by First World War nurse Agnes von Kurowski that led him to abandoning all subsequent women in his life before they could abandon him. I think that even if he had married Agnes, he would have moved on to someone else within a few years. It was part of his impulsive, novelty-seeking nature. Like a magpie spotting a shiny bauble he couldn't resist. And he would use all of his considerable charm to win each new bauble. He boasted once that he had bedded every girl he wanted, and some that he had not wanted. The less charming side of the great writer. As a father, he was equally hot and cold. Whenever he was with his boys, he would be with them all day, fishing, hunting, skiing, goofing around. A great dad, and they loved being with him. But when they went back to their mothers, it was as if they didn't exist. So, what can we conclude about his personality? I guess it depends on how much you like his writing. Bold, energetic, confident, determined, brave. Or restless, insecure, narcissistic, and dangerously reckless. There are stories that support all of these adjectives and many more. One of his most enduring character traits was his need to be best. The best writer, of course, but also the best boxer, the best fisherman, the best hunter, the best journalist, and the best lover. He didn't like criticism and would permanently drop friends if they dared to cross him in any way. He could be warm and generous, but switch instantly to being bitter and envious, and he rarely, very rarely, apologised and made up. He enjoyed the company of men from all walks of life, writers, academics, sportsmen, soldiers, and guys with hard physical jobs, but not psychiatrists. He avoided going anywhere near one until his final few months, and once said his Corona typewriter was his analyst. That hasn't stopped psychoanalysts having a go and hypothesizing about him, however. He acted often not through free choice, but because he was driven by some dimly understood internal pressure whose murky persuasiveness only shammed choice. He fished, hunted, and sought danger not because he wanted to, but because he had to, in order to escape some greater internal danger. Why? Why couldn't he have gone hunting? Because he enjoyed it. I don't believe everything has to be a reaction that only a clever analyst can unravel. It has even been suggested that his whole He-Man posturing thing was a defence against latent homosexuality. But I'm a neuropsychiatrist. All of these speculations about Oedipal urges and castration anxiety are interesting, but I think it was his genetic inheritance that had the greatest influence on Hemingway's mental health. It is likely that his father, with his mood swings and need for extended rest cures, would nowadays be diagnosed with bipolar affective disorder, and this, combined with his mother's emotional dysregulation, was a toxic mix that would eventually lead to 3, possibly 4 of their 6 children taking their own lives. And there is a strong case for Ernest himself having what we would now call bipolar disorder. He had clear episodes of depression. In 1936, when he was languishing in Key West with Pauline, he wrote a letter to Dos Passos. I felt that gigantic, bloody emptiness and nothingness, like I couldn't ever make love, fight, write, and was all for death. Although he used a somewhat earthier word to describe his lack of libido. And the pendulum often swung rapidly in the other direction to periods of manic energy. As a youngster, he would sit up all night reading poetry, and in one sustained episode in 1924, Hadley described him as sky-high, emotionally intense, and ready to explode. His company was so difficult to tolerate that she stayed behind when he went off on one of his trips. Mostly, he was able to channel this energy into creative output. In this episode, he dashed off 7 short stories in a matter of weeks. In another 10 years later, he wrote to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, that his latest stories contained the best writing he had ever produced, and he was the only writer at that time capable of such writing. During these episodes, his mind would be buzzing. He once wrote that he had taken to getting up about 2 or so in the morning and going out to the little house to work until daylight, because when you're writing on a book, you can't sleep. Your brain races at night and you write all the stuff in your head. In his final years, there were no more highs to lift him. His mood sank ever deeper, and he became paranoid, thinking he was being watched and that he was going to get into trouble. But he was in trouble. His once faultless memory and ability to hold the complex structure of a novel in his mind was going. Those that knew him saw the decline accelerate in his final 18 months, and Hemingway could see it himself. General Lanham, commander of the 22nd Infantry in Normandy, and perhaps Hemingway's closest friend for the last quarter of his life, once said to Hemingway's wife, Mary, that her husband was frozen in adolescence. When he heard of the remark later, he rejoined, "Perhaps adolescence isn't such a bad place to be frozen." But in July 1961, a few weeks before his 62nd birthday, his adolescence came to an end. Thank you for watching. I know it's not easy thinking about difficult subjects such as mental illness and the S word that I can't mention on YouTube. But I think that being open about mental health and how it impacts on people's lives empowers those struggling with these issues to seek help a little bit sooner. Hemingway himself didn't want to go there, and some have interpreted his whole life as a defence against dark thoughts. But his granddaughter, Mariel Hemingway, sister of Margot, who lost her battle with her demons, and sister of Joan, usually known as Muffet, who has spent periods in hospital and been diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, Mariel has been more willing to confront these issues and bravely discuss her family's difficulties in her film Running from Crazy. And one of the things I did want to do with this video is correct some of the misinformation about Hemingway's final illness. One damaging falsehood is that the ECT treatment he had in his last 6 months caused his memory problems. It did not. His memory was on the decline long before this, and the treatment improved his mood and energy for a while. It just didn't last. Another, even more dangerous assertion is that it was his enforced abstinence in his final months that hastened his end, and that if he had been allowed to carry on drinking, he would have lived longer. This is the justification of alcoholics trying to convince themselves they are self-medicating rather than accepting they are addicts. I could go on, and probably on some more. Ernest Hemingway was one of the most fascinating and complex characters of the 20th century, but I'd better finish here. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments and any suggestions you may have for who I should tackle next. But I'll say bye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.